In 52 BCE, Julius Caesar faced the greatest crisis of his career. All of Gaul had risen in rebellion against Rome under a charismatic chieftain named Vercingetorix. Caesar's legions were outnumbered, surrounded, and facing starvation. His political enemies in Rome were already planning his downfall, convinced that the great general had finally met his match. But Caesar had one more card to play, the most audacious engineering project in military history. At a hilltop fortress called Alesia, he would attempt something no general had ever tried before, building two massive walls to fight a war on two fronts simultaneously. It was either brilliant strategy or complete madness. The fate of Gaul, Rome, and Caesar himself would be decided by whether Roman engineering could triumph over impossible odds. For 8 years, Caesar had been conquering Gaul tribe by tribe, using his superior tactics and Roman discipline to defeat much larger Celtic armies. He had crossed the Rhine, invaded Britain, and brought Roman civilization to lands that had never known foreign rule. But by 52 BCE, the Gauls had learned from their defeats. They realized that fighting Caesar in separate tribal armies was suicide. What they needed was unity, one leader capable of uniting all the Gallic tribes against Rome. That leader was Vercingetorix of the Arverni, a young nobleman whose name meant Great King of Warriors. Unlike previous Gallic chieftains who relied on brute force and Celtic courage, Vercingetorix was a strategic genius who understood Roman weaknesses. He launched a coordinated rebellion across Gaul, using scorched earth tactics to deny Caesar's armies food and supplies. Rather than meeting the Romans in open battle, where their discipline gave them the advantage, Vercingetorix struck at Caesar's supply lines and used guerrilla warfare to bleed the legions slowly. For the first time in his Gallic campaigns, Caesar found himself on the defensive. His army was scattered across hostile territory, constantly harassed by Gallic warriors who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Roman soldiers were deserting, and Caesar's political position in Rome was becoming increasingly precarious. Caesar needed a decisive victory to crush the rebellion once and for all. But Vercingetorix was too smart to give him the pitched battle he wanted. The showdown came when Vercingetorix retreated to the hilltop fortress of Alesia with 80,000 of his finest warriors. The fortress was perfectly positioned on a plateau surrounded by steep cliffs and rivers, making it virtually impossible to assault directly. Most generals would have recognized Alesia as impregnable and looked for an easier target. But Caesar saw an opportunity. If he couldn't take the fortress by storm, he would starve it into submission. Caesar ordered his 8 legions, about 50,000 men, to begin construction of a wall completely surrounding Alesia. This circumvallation, as the Romans called it, would prevent anyone from leaving the fortress. No food could get in, no messengers could get out. It was a massive undertaking. The wall stretched for 10 miles around the entire plateau, complete with ditches, spikes, and defensive positions. Roman engineers worked day and night, turning the siege into a race between construction and starvation. But Vercingetorix had anticipated this move. Before the Roman wall was completed, he sent his cavalry to escape through the remaining gaps. Their mission was to rally every tribe in Gaul for a massive relief army that would attack Caesar from behind. When Caesar's scouts reported this development, the Roman general faced a terrifying reality. Soon he would be trapped between 80,000 Gauls inside Alesia and potentially hundreds of thousands more attacking from outside. His army would be caught in a vice with no escape route. Most commanders would have retreated immediately. Caesar ordered his men to build a second wall. The contravallation was even more ambitious than the first wall. Stretching for 13 miles, it faced outward to protect the Romans from the coming relief army. When completed, Caesar's legions would be trapped between 2 walls of their own construction, but so would their enemies. It was the most audacious military engineering project in ancient history. Caesar was essentially building a fortress within a fortress, creating 3 separate battlefields where he could fight on interior lines, while his enemies were forced to coordinate attacks across vast distances. The construction took weeks of backbreaking labor. Roman legionnaires, who were trained soldiers rather than engineers, had to become experts in earthwork construction virtually overnight. They dug ditches 15 feet deep, erected wooden walls 20 feet high, and created elaborate defensive systems with hidden traps and obstacles. Meanwhile, inside Alesia, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Vercingetorix had planned for a siege, but not one lasting this long. Food supplies dwindled, then disappeared entirely. The proud Gallic warriors were reduced to eating their horses, then their leather equipment, and finally, anything remotely edible. Desperate to reduce the number of mouths to feed, the Gallic council made a brutal decision. They expelled all the civilians from Alesia, men, women, and children who had sought protection within the fortress walls. These unfortunate refugees found themselves trapped in no man's land between the fortress and Caesar's inner wall. The Romans refused to let them through, while the Gauls had cast them out. They starved to death in sight of both armies, a grim reminder of the stakes in this conflict. Caesar watched this tragedy unfold, but refused to show mercy. He understood that feeding these civilians would strain his own limited supplies and potentially prolong the siege. It was a cold calculation, but Caesar had learned that sentiment was a luxury commanders couldn't afford. As summer turned to autumn, the long-awaited relief army finally appeared. Vercingetorix's messengers had done their work well. Over 250,000 Gallic warriors from 60 different tribes had answered the call, the largest army ever assembled in Gaul. The sight of this massive force sent tremors through the Roman ranks. Caesar's 8 legions were now completely surrounded by enemies who outnumbered them more than 6 to 1. The relief army could attack the outer wall, while Vercingetorix's forces assaulted from inside. Roman discipline would mean nothing if they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But Caesar's engineering had given him a crucial advantage. The double wall system forced his enemies to fight 2 separate battles that they couldn't properly coordinate. The relief army couldn't communicate effectively with Vercingetorix, and neither force could support the other. The first attack came at dawn. The relief army charged Caesar's outer wall with ladders, grappling hooks, and raw Celtic fury. At the same time, Vercingetorix led his starving warriors out of Alesia to assault the inner wall. The Romans found themselves fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, exactly as Caesar had planned. But rather than splitting his forces, the double wall system allowed him to move troops rapidly between threatened points while keeping his enemies separated. Roman legionnaires manning the walls fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant death for every man. They hurled javelins, dropped stones, and used every trick of Roman engineering to hold their positions. The first assault was repelled, but barely. The relief army fell back to plan their next attack, while Vercingetorix's men retreated into Alesia to lick their wounds. Caesar knew he couldn't survive many more such attacks. His supplies were also running low, and his men were exhausted from constant construction and fighting. He needed to break the stalemate before his own position became untenable. The decisive moment came when Gallic scouts discovered what they thought was a weakness in Caesar's outer wall. On the northern side of the fortifications, where the terrain was roughest, the Roman wall didn't extend as far as elsewhere. The Gauls believed they had found a gap they could exploit. 60,000 of the finest Gallic warriors, led by Vercingetorix's cousin Vercingetorix, prepared for a night attack on this weak point. If they could break through, they could roll up Caesar's entire defensive line and end the siege in victory. But Caesar had anticipated this move. The apparent weakness was actually a carefully prepared killing ground. Roman engineers had filled the area with hidden traps, sharpened stakes concealed in pits, iron spikes driven into the ground, and caltrops scattered to maim charging warriors. As the Gallic attack developed, Caesar made his own masterstroke. Taking his personal cavalry and his finest legionnaires, he rode out of the fortifications and attacked the relief army from behind, just as they were assaulting his walls. The psychological impact was devastating. The Gallic warriors, who thought they had Caesar trapped, suddenly found themselves attacked from a direction they thought was safe. Panic spread through their ranks as they realized the Roman general had outmaneuvered them once again. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix could see the relief army breaking apart. His own warriors, weakened by months of starvation, lacked the strength for another major assault. The great Gallic alliance was crumbling before his eyes. Vercingetorix faced an impossible choice. He could fight to the death, ensuring that Alesia's defenders died with him, or he could surrender himself to save his people. For a proud Gallic chieftain, surrender to Rome was the ultimate humiliation. But Vercingetorix chose his people over his pride. In one of the most dramatic scenes in ancient history, he put on his finest armor, mounted his best horse, and rode alone out of Alesia towards Caesar's camp. According to Roman accounts, Vercingetorix rode 3 times around Caesar's chair before throwing down his weapons in surrender. The great rebellion was over. The victory at Alesia secured Caesar's conquest of Gaul and provided him with the wealth and prestige he needed for his coming civil war with Pompey. The engineering methods pioneered at Alesia would be used by Roman armies for centuries, but the siege was more than just a military victory. It was a demonstration of Roman engineering genius applied to warfare. Caesar had literally built his way to victory, using construction as a weapon as deadly as any sword or spear. The double wall system at Alesia proved that with enough ingenuity and determination, even impossible odds could be overcome. It showed that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from strength or courage, but from refusing to accept that something can't be done. In the end, Caesar didn't defeat Vercingetorix through superior numbers or better weapons. He defeated him by changing the rules of the game entirely, turning a siege into a construction project, and making Roman engineering the decisive factor in Gallic independence. The walls that trapped the Gauls at Alesia became the foundation of Roman dominance over Western Europe, built one stone at a time by soldiers who refused to accept defeat.